Well, after listening to Anya for 10 minutes, I should just to wrap it up and not try to imitate her eloquence. She mentioned Brexit. I'm going to work backwards from the way I had initially arranged to talk, because in 40 minutes I can go on like an Irish person and make 80 out of 40, and we'd only get halfway through. But it is one of the things that I would talk about, but I talk about it in the context, which I'll come to later, of this talk about a border poll is just stimulating anger and bringing up ancient grievances, and will not advance any cause in any way, because there is not a remote chance of there being a border poll that would make any difference to the status of Northern Ireland as it is now. And this will probably be true in 10 years, maybe 15. The majority of Catholics in Northern Ireland. But maybe you go as far as the 20 years before anything like unity might emerge on the as a viable alternative to the power sharing agreement. So let me begin by saying that majorities in both communities in Northern Ireland agree that life is better than 20 years ago. Overall, 71% think so, Catholics more so than Protestants. My talk, however, will not run through a slew of metrics to try to measure the agreement, social, economic and political impacts, both positive and negative. It would address some of the more collateral psychological impacts of the conflict that should lead one to the conclusion that Northern Ireland is one sick society, and the underpinnings of the trauma that still envelop it are neither being fully addressed nor understood. The power sharing agreements have been in an abyss since the elections of March last year. And really this is a disgrace. These are about issues that are solvable, and the major players are playing their tunes to a different agenda, not to the agenda of advancing the cause of people. Northern Ireland will never develop the cohesiveness to integrate the disparate parts of its asymmetrical narratives of history, bridge the social economic fault lines, or agree a common polity without an acknowledgement on all sides that post-conflict trauma is of epidemic proportions, with negative impacts on political discourse, as well as being the wellspring of debilitating mental health problems. As I said, as regards the prospects for a united Ireland any time in the future, the short answer is that there are none, and even for those who are advocating for a border poll, or as I said, are encouraging behaviours that can only stimulate divisions and raise new wounds that are raw and open, and give the ugly voice to the residual grievances that people on both sides of the divide still nurture. I will address four things. I hope I have time for four. One is mental health and trauma. The other is the crisis of Protestant Existentialism. The third is the fallacy of United Ireland. And the fourth is, if I can find it, is the impact of the walls in Belfast as a metric that gives some real measure of the degree of fear that still is in both communities. You know, on the walls, which I'm not going to talk about now, these walls have become a permanent part of the political environment of the people who live around them. Some of the walls end up in their black yards. They are a part of their everyday normalcy. And any move to remove them alters the political landscape, the geographical landscape in which they've lived for 40 years, and what they perceive across the road as the other who they believe will harm them. And the fear of bringing down the wall has nothing to do with the United Ireland or loyalism or anything like that. It has to do with fear. And fear marches to its own time clock. Fear is an emotion. It's something we can't grasp and measure. But if you talk to people along those fault lines, you very clearly get an understanding of their concerns that if those walls come down. Let me address one of the main items that distresses me very much. A report published by the World Mental Health Association in 2012 shows Northern Ireland as having the highest recorded rate of post-traumatic stress disorder when compared with 28 conflict-ridden countries across the world, including Northern Ireland or war-torn territories such as Lebanon and Israel. Northern Ireland is enveloped in a mental time warp. Not only are accounts of the conflict handed down from one generation to the next, but traumas associated with the conflict distort the attributes of the narrative as they are transmitted in the same way, a phenomenon known as the intergenerational transmission of trauma. According to the BBC, in 1914, 1 in 5 people in Northern Ireland showed signs of mental health problems, while the number of middle-aged people who committed suicide was particularly high. In 2016, 80% of students in Northern Ireland experienced mental health anxieties. And we have to think about that. Why are 80% of young people going to school in Belfast or Coleraine or Londonderry or any other place? Why are they absorbed with mental problems? It certainly is not a sign of normalcy. During the conflict between 1969 and 1998, it is estimated that around 3,600 people were killed. Since the Good Friday Belfast Agreement went into effect, over 4,000 people have committed suicide, 3/4 of them male. The 3,600 killed in the conflict approximate that 1 in every 200 households suffered a fatal loss. Adding the number of families where a member committed suicide and assuming the two are exclusive, the estimate is 1 in every 100 families experienced a death related to either suicide or the conflict. There are also a recorded 107,000 non-fatal casualties, which translates approximately into 1 in 7 households with the family member injured due to the conflict. In these tight territorial enclaves, neighbour knows neighbour, For every casualty, there is at least one close relative who is grievously affected. Families are close-knit. A murder of one leaves a stain on all. It has been estimated that 39% of Northern Ireland's population suffered a traumatic event during the conflict. In the 32 years, that's from 1965, 4 years before the conflict began, to 1977, 3,883 deaths by suicide were recorded. In 16 years after the peace agreement, through the end of 2014, 3,900 people died by suicide, roughly the same number over half the period of time. Northern Ireland used to have the lowest rate of suicide in the UK. Since the beginning of this decade, it has had the highest suicide rates, and suicides in most deprived areas are 3 to 4 times higher than in affluent areas. My own work in tangential fields leads me to venture that the sense of social cohesion conflict ensures was far tighter during the conflict era. The University of Ulster alludes to research showing the troubles may a key factor in raising suicide rates. It cites as an example children caught up in difficult or violent situations. It postulates may be less psychologically resilient in later life. This risk factor has not been addressed in current suicide prevention strategies. In a paper published in 2013, Michael Tomlinson wrote, "Since 1998, the suicide rate in Northern Ireland has almost doubled." A situation such as this is without parallel in a Western country, and the research that should probe the attitudes and beliefs that leads one to take one's life has to be understood in both a social and political complex. In global terms, Northern Ireland is now in the Premier League. The small body of research that has been conducted identifies adults whose childhoods had coincided with the worst of the Troubles during the 1970s, 1917 to 1977, as the age group most susceptible to suicide in the decades after 1998. In other words, the cohort of children and young people who experienced the worst of the violence in the 1970s is the cohort with the highest rate, most rapidly increasing suicide rates in the decade after 1998. Some research conducted by Siobhan O'Neill at the University of Ulster has established that there is a direct link between suicidal behaviour and having experienced a traumatic event, including those related to suicide. But what would account for the death of young people who've never experienced war? We don't know. But one route of inquiry leads us to the road of biology. We usually think of PSTD as a psychological disorder. Recent studies, however, suggest that traumatic events may change people on a molecular level, and it could be these molecular changes that lead to the symptoms of PSTD. PSTD may be as much biological as psychological. One groundbreaking study shows that people who experience traumatic experience are more likely to have these molecular epigenetic changes, which can be, of course, biologically transmitted. If anyone doesn't know what epigenetic means, I'll explain it afterwards. I don't know how many people know biology here. I know very little myself, so I'd have to take them on faith. But the term epigenetic changes refer to particular molecules that stick to particular parts of the DNA So they're not genetic changes, they're not changes in the gene encoding that we all have within it, but there are changes around the DNA itself. Calling Northern Ireland a sick society may be stretching the extent of the problem, but it is one that should be put on a political front burner. Just think of it again. In the 20 years since the Good Friday Agreement went into effect, more people have been killed by suicide than all the people who were killed in the 30 years of the conflict. And while we paraded each death during the conflict and talked about sectarianism, republicanism and loyalism, and whether or not the various governmental structures might break down or collapse, the deaths of these people from suicide are deaths in silence. We hear very little about them. In our academic institutions, very little attention is paid to them. And I would feel, going forward, that one of the challenges of the next 20 years is for politicians and public institutions to take seriously the fact that Northern Ireland is indeed a sick society. It is a society in recovery. It is a society where reconciliation, mediation, arbitration, and counselling is very, very badly needed. Now, PSTD is not the only disorder significant members of Northern Ireland's population experience. Another disorder called continuous traumatic stress, or CTS, is another phenomenon. During a conflict, an ethos of conflict emerges. This ethos reflects a community's shared experience of a remembered past. It's defined by 8 interrelated benefits: beliefs about the justness of one cause, beliefs about security, beliefs about positive self-image, beliefs about the justness of the in-groups, beliefs of victimization, beliefs that delegitimize the opponent, beliefs of patriotism, beliefs about unity, and beliefs about peace. An ethos of conflict cements social cohesion. But while citizens on both sides of the divide are equally exposed to PSTD, both, but to a far greater degree, the Protestant community is also exposed to it in a way that their attitudes and behaviours on political issues will rarely align with Catholics. PTS is defined as a situation where danger and threat are largely faceless and unpredictable, something constant and eternal that colours the whole web of relations across the society and the daily life of its citizens. The mental life of the person experiencing CTS is characterised by preoccupation and thoughts about potential futuristic traumatic events rather than with the details of a previously unprocessed event. The absence of protection from threat and danger is of equal significance as actual threat of exposure. One characteristic of CTS is that of anticipatory anxiety, that from worrying of a threatening situation that may or may not occur, or whether that fear is realistic or not realistic, that this committee in the head can permanently transform how people respond to threats. The lens of the imagined is more fear-driven than the level of the real. Large parts of the Protestant community, especially in loyalist areas, are enveloped in CTS. Both PSTD and CTS feed voraciously on a sense of victimization and communities that feel they are victimized act in ways that reinforces their convictions that they are victims. That said, a catalyst for CTS is the most significant statistic of the last 20 years, that of inexorable Protestant population decline and the seeds of Catholic ascendancy. The population breakdown by community background and age, as the 2001 census indicated, Catholics outnumber Protestants in all age groups under 40. 6 years later, they are likely to be in the process of becoming or are actually members of the new majority. Protestants, a majority since the creation of the statelet in 1920, with borders agreed on the Boundary Commission's recommendations in 1925 to adjustments that would ensure a permanent Protestant majority, has not come to terms with the new emerging inexorable reality. A state of CTS perfectly aligns itself with the core of the Protestant psyche. The Protestant community is grappling with an existential crisis. It is not for political reasons that you see Israeli flags flying in loyalist enclaves, but for psychological identification, as you see Palestinian flags in Republican neighborhoods. But the loyalist identification with the Israeli is around the fact that they can bond and understand each other on the basis of the prevalence of continuous stress, traumatic stress, which is a feature of Israeli society. After 20 years of non-violence and peace agreements, sufficient to preclude a return to whole-scale violence, but with occasional retail shootings or bombings, these characteristics begin to wane. The social cohesion, which the interconnection of experience and behaviors, the ethos of conflict, provided the sense of loss that accompanied the peace agreement in both communities, but at different rates, thus producing differential psychological and sociological impacts. The social psychiatrist, a pioneer in his field, Peter Morris, wrote that the ideology of conflict has very powerful appeal for those who have lost their sense of belonging. It relieves the threat of personal disintegration because the structure of conflict provides a side to take, a reference for behavior, a meaning for the experience of loss, and with this reassurance, life becomes more manageable. Protestants are losing their sense of belonging. It's a question for deeper and existential than identity, the feeling that one does not belong in any group or in any place. Indeed, the research into ISIS shows many reasons why young people or older people join ISIS, but the one common thread is that they all wanted a sense of belonging to something. And ISIS, like the IRA in the 1970s, provided the meaning and that sense of belonging. Between 1999 and 2000, the number of alcohol deaths have increased. Alcohol-related deaths are 4 times more likely in deprived areas than affluent. And what is happening to stress here is that protracted conflicts become part of the identity of the protagonists themselves. Morris again. The ideology of conflict, he writes, does not press claims or make demands only for their own sake, but to sustain the conflict itself. Its intransigence wards off the unbearable strain of having to incorporate the contradictions they do not understand and cannot help being identified with both sides. How are we to interpret the phrase, the unbearable strain? The loss of one's part of identity must be mourned like any other loss. It has to go through the stages of grieving. The Protestant working class, there is a pervasive belief that they lost the peace agreement, and as they witness their own governments decline through immigration of the young and a high mortality rate due to having an older population, their experience of the present are a precursor to their expectations for the future. There is a palpable sense of loss for a retrieval of a past they fought to perpetuate. But the knowledge that they had that they belonged to a ruling class was an expression of their superiority. In the lingo, that's called the narcissism of small differences. When the symbols of the cultural manifestations of unionist dominance are dismantled, loyalists fiercely cling to them. Hence the violence after the Catholic-dominated City Council decision to restrict the Union flag from flying over Belfast City Hall to 18 days. The loyalists verged on the sacrilegious. It was a loss. Every time a parade commission reroutes an orange parade or prohibits it from flying through national areas is a loss. No greater than restrictions on marching down from Glencree Church to Portadown Centre on the 12th of July through the Catholic estates and Caravaggio Road. Each Sunday, 4 Orangemen march from Glencree Church to Portadown with a petition for a license to hold the parade. The bonfires, the venom of what we call the silly season, underline the new direction of the conflict, from violence over territory to disagreement over the symbols that are manifestations of the neural time warps, negating the sense of belonging. On the Protestant side are the consciousness of evolving lack of control. On the Catholic side, there is a consciousness of getting control. The losses continue. The 1998 agreement is referred to as the Good Friday Agreement, not the Good Friday Belfast Agreement. That's a loss. On a comparative basis, fewer Protestant kids complete high school. That's a loss. Catholic kids get higher grades. That's a loss. Queen's University, once synonymous with Ulster's Protestants elites, now graduates a higher proportion of Catholics than Protestants. That too is a loss. There is nothing that generates hope as they look across the political horizon. From being a majority in Northern Ireland since its founding, and a minority in the Irish state on its borders, it is about to become a minority in both territories. Having once ruled everything, they've now imagined a future where they will share nothing. Another loss. Reassuring them that United Ireland is not around the corner at this point does not reassure them. They are dealing with the imaginations of their perceptions. Because they view the purpose with a lens calibrated by continuous traumatic stress, the fact that they are reassured that a united Ireland will not be true, that power sharing in one form or another, in many consociational forms, will exist for times to come, they do not believe it. Because they view the future with a lens calibrated by continuous traumatic stress, the fact that they are reassured that in Northern Ireland will not be the case, that power sharing in any one of its many consolidations is here to stay. It does little to alleviate the threats as they envisage them. They feel defeated and they act in ways that reinforce that belief. So I'd sum up this portion of what I was saying as number one, there is a crisis of mental health of extreme proportions in Northern Ireland. And that means that the behaviours of the people who are either in dialogue with each other or in business with each other or trying to negotiate political arrangements all are suffering from epidemic post-stress disorder or continuous stress disorder. They are not acting in a normal way because these behaviors inculcate and steer their normalcy away, even though they are not aware of it. Second is the fact that loyalism has reached a turning point. And that turning point is they now face a future where they will never again be the majority community. They will look at their past and see that 70 years of being in the majority have gone down the drain. And of course, this is something they exist both as a community and in a political sense. This is something that will cause problems in the future. And third, I was referring to their multiple disorders. Post-traumatic stress disorder and continuous traumatic stress, both are different. PSTD looks at events as they occurred in the past. Continuous stress disorder looks at events as they may happen in the future. And what happens with people suffering from post-traumatic stress is that the real and the imagined can coalesce, and a person is no longer sure whether he or she is imagining a reality or whether in fact it is a real reality. The Catholic community it sits in a very peculiar position. Get these things out of my way. You take them all away? You tell me to shut up? Yeah, 16, 17, 18. I just need page 15. Thank you. I said at the beginning that a border poll is nonsense, that all it would do is aggravate the raw divisions that still exist in the recesses of the minds and consciousness of both communities in Northern Ireland. What happened at 15? Well, short, let me get it a bit shorter. Can you hand it to me, Eamon? Yeah. That's 16. Intercession. This is what the politicians at Stormont do every day. Flip, flop, flip, flop. More paper, more paper, more paper. That's lovely, thank you. If we look at voting patterns, as far back as the 1930s, through the rest of that century and all of the 20th century and the opening decades of the 21st century, the one defining immutable characteristic is that Catholics vote for parties Protestants do not vote for, and Protestants vote for parties Catholics do not vote for. In other words, voting was and continues to be along communal lines. Allegiance is not to what a political party stands for on the constitutional issue, but to the community with which one identifies. There has never been sustained support among Catholics for unification at any point in time since the founding of Northern Ireland in 1920, even during the worst years of the conflict in the 1970s. In other words, the IRA conducted a coercive campaign of violence to bring about a united Ireland that did not coalesce with the opinions of the major part of its constituency. Which begs the question, was the IRA's murderous campaign of violence on behalf of the cause of Irish unification supported by a minority of the minority in Northern Ireland when a majority of that minority would opt for a different outcome? What I'm saying is, nationalist Catholics, a minority in Northern Ireland, a minority of that minority undertook a campaign of violence to achieve Irish unity, while a majority of that minority that supported it did not want a united Ireland. What it illustrates, and we see this increasingly in parts of Europe, is that a minority dedicated to its cause, organized, disciplined, and committed, with a well-defined strategy, that will go to any lengths to get its way, will always outmatch a passive majority. Minorities drive change. Minorities drive revolutions. In Catalonia, where opinion surveys consistently showed that a majority opposed independence, a passionate minority dedicated to the cause of Catalan independence now holds the future of Spain to ransom. Religion continues to be the best predicator of voting patterns. Since the founding of Northern Ireland in 1920, almost without exception, Catholics have voted for nationalist or Republican parties. Majority area Protestants vote for unionist parties. For decades, the conflict from 1968 to 1998 was posited in terms of Catholics versus Protestants, Catholics being synonymous with standing for unity with the rest of Ireland, Protestants for preservation of the Union. The conflict was and is perceived of in two competing identities. To do what they do on Facebook. The proportion of Protestants supporting, sorry, that's not 1980. Yeah. Well, yeah, that a minority, a determined minority, will always outmatch a passive majority, and that's what we're seeing in Catalonia today. Religion continues to be the best predicator of voting patterns in Northern Ireland. Since the founding of Northern Ireland in 1920, almost without exception, Catholics have voted for nationalist or Republican parties. Majority area Protestants voted for unionist parties. Today, an aggregate of nationalist parties of various leanings hold more seats in the suspended assembly than unionist parties. For decades, the conflict from 1968 to 98 was posited in terms, I said, of two competing identities. It is no longer accurate to describe Northern Ireland as a case of two competing identities with diametrically opposing aspirations. This is a misnomer. A more nuanced contextual framework was emerging as a result of a shift in the demographic balance in favour of Catholics and in growing propensity among Catholics to support the Union. Indeed, what is remarkable is that surveys of Northern Ireland Catholics since the Belfast Good Friday Agreement have consistently shown that fewer than 50% chose a united Ireland as the most workable or acceptable form of a solution. The 2013 annual Northern Life and Times survey found that a united Ireland was favoured option of 15% of the population, while the remaining part of the United Kingdom was the favoured long-term option of 66% of the population. And if you keep that figure in mind for a minute, you will see how absurd it would be at this point in time. Just a concluding sentence, because I asked Eamon to put his finger up when I got to the time to put his finger up. Unionist support for the Union or not being part of a united Ireland is rock hard. It hasn't moved in 50 years, 80% plus consistently. On the other hand, Catholic support for Northern Ireland is highly fungible, rarely exceeding 50%. 56% of the SDLP's voters would not vote for United Ireland. 35% of Sinn Féin voters are not in favour of a united Ireland. But when they go to the polls, they're not voting on those issues. They're voting along communal lines, which means Catholics support Catholics and Protestants support Catholics. And I'll wrap it up there, and I'm sorry for my various little fiddling about with very important documents that will become law.